Welcome to Alien Love Chronicles, where love defies gravity, fate is rewritten among the stars, and the impossible becomes reality. Tonight, we bring you a story of destiny, survival, and an unbreakable bond between a human and an alien warrior. Nathan Cross never believed in fate, until the night he saved Zyra. A simple act of survival has now bound their souls together, tying him to a prophecy that could change the fate of an entire galaxy. But who is he really? And what ancient power has been awakened within him? Stay with us until the very end. This is a journey you won't forget. Don't miss a single second, because the truth will leave you breathless. Leave a comment below. What do you think will happen next? Subscribe to Alien Love Chronicles and be part of this intergalactic adventure. Nathan Cross had seen countless planets. Some were barren wastelands, nothing but endless dunes or frozen tundras. Others were hostile jungles, teeming with creatures that lurked in the shadows, waiting for a misstep. But this world was different. It was beautiful. Hauntingly, dangerously beautiful. The sky shimmered like an unbroken sea of amethyst, with twin moons casting an eerie glow over a landscape that should not exist. Towering trees, their trunks woven with veins of silver light, stretched impossibly high, their bioluminescent leaves pulsing in slow, hypnotic rhythms. Rivers didn't carve through valleys or break against jagged cliffs. Instead, they hovered. Long ribbons of liquid sapphire, undisturbed by gravity, twisting through the air like celestial ribbons. They reflected the sky, creating the illusion of walking through a world that was both above and below, endless and infinite. Nathan adjusted the strap of his survival pack, the weight of familiar comfort against his back. His boots pressed into soft, luminescent moss, sending tiny bursts of golden light flickering outward like fireflies scattering at dusk. It would be easy to get lost here, to forget the dangers that could be lurking just beyond sight. But he wasn't here to admire the view. He was here because of the signal. It had been faint, barely a whisper against the static in his ship's communications array. But it was there, a pattern, a pulse. Something that suggested intelligent life, or something close to it. And now, after days of scanning and navigating treacherous terrain, he was close. Too close. The wind shifted, carrying a sound that made his breath hitch. A whisper. Not a normal whisper. Not the rustling of leaves or the sigh of the wind through the trees. It was low, rhythmic, almost human, but not quite. Nathan's fingers tightened around the grip of his plasma blade, the hum of its dormant energy a reassuring presence at his hip. His instincts told him to move, to keep going, to ignore the phantom voices drifting through the trees. But he had long learned that instincts and logic didn't always align. This planet was alive, not just teeming with life, but sentient in ways he didn't yet understand. He could feel it, the way the trees seemed to lean when he passed. The way the bioluminescent flora pulsed slightly offbeat from his own heartbeat, as if syncing to his presence. Then, the sky erupted. A streak of blazing white fire ripped through the darkness, tearing across the twin-moon sky. Nathan froze. His first thought was a meteor, some rogue chunk of rock burning through the atmosphere. But no, there was metal in that glow, the unmistakable gleam of a ship caught in freefall. His visor automatically adjusted, filtering out the glare, allowing him to see it clearly. A vessel, sleek, aerodynamic, but damaged beyond recognition. Pieces were breaking off, spiraling away like dying embers, vanishing into the void. Smoke trailed behind it, thick and black, leaving a scar across the heavens. And then, the impact. The shockwave shook the very ground beneath him, sending tremors through the glowing moss, rippling through the air like an invisible scream. In the distance, birds, or what passed for birds here, exploded from the treetops, their iridescent wings catching the moonlight in flashes of emerald and violet. The floating rivers trembled, droplets of liquid sapphire breaking free and drifting weightlessly before settling back into their impossible currents. Nathan exhaled slowly. His HUD flickered as his scanner reactivated, pinging the crash site's coordinates. It wasn't far. He should turn back. This wasn't his problem. He wasn't a hero, and he sure as hell wasn't a rescue team. If someone had crashed, it was probably already too late for them. And yet, Nathan clenched his jaw. Something inside him refused to let go. He had spent years ignoring things that weren't his business. Ignoring the distress signals, the fading cries, the things that would only drag him into someone else's mess. That was how you survived out here. And yet, his hand moved to his belt, fingers brushing against the reinforced strap of his pack. His body had already made the decision before his mind caught up. With a quiet sigh, Nathan took off toward the crash site. Each step quickened his pulse, but not from exertion, from anticipation. Something about that ship, about the way it fell, about the energy rippling through the air in its wake, was wrong. Or maybe, just maybe, it was meant to happen. He didn't know why, but a quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered, "Whatever you're about to find is going to change everything." The jungle thickened as he pushed forward, the luminescent flora dimming around him as if retreating from what lay ahead. The forest knew something he didn't. The air grew heavy, electric. He reached the edge of a cliffside clearing, stopping just before the drop. Below, the wreckage of the ship lay smoldering, metal twisted and broken, flames licking at its remains. But that wasn't what held his attention. It was the figure struggling to crawl from the debris. Nathan's breath caught. Through the swirling smoke, illuminated by the flickering embers, was someone, something, still alive. A woman. Or at least, she looked like one. Her skin shimmered, shifting between deep emerald and golden light. Strange patterns pulsed along her body, glowing softly, like the energy of the planet itself had etched itself into her flesh. Even from a distance, Nathan could see she was injured, badly, and yet, she was still moving, still fighting to escape the wreckage. Something twisted in his chest, that old, instinctive pull to help, to reach out. He knew in that moment he had two choices: turn away, pretend he never saw her, or go down there and change the course of his life forever. Nathan exhaled. The choice was never really a choice at all. He gripped his plasma blade tighter and descended into the unknown. Nathan moved cautiously through the bioluminescent jungle, his breath shallow as his boots pressed into the soft, glowing moss beneath him. The entire landscape pulsed with an otherworldly energy, as if the planet itself were breathing. Every step sent tiny ripples of golden light flickering outward, shimmering briefly before fading into darkness. The beauty of it was mesmerizing, but there was something unsettling about the silence that followed him. No insects, no rustling leaves, no distant howls of predators. Just an eerie, unnatural quiet that pressed against his ears like an unspoken warning. The air carried the sharp scent of burning metal, a stark contrast to the sweet, earthy fragrance of the jungle. As Nathan moved deeper into the dense foliage, the wreckage of the ship came into view. It had carved a deep scar through the terrain, its remains half buried under glowing vines that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Smoke curled into the night sky, carrying embers that drifted lazily before vanishing into the endless stretch of stars above. His pulse quickened. Someone was in there. He could see the way the wreckage still smoldered, hear the faint hissing of exposed wires sparking against the cool, humid air. If there had been a pilot, they wouldn't have had long. Most crashes like this ended in instant death. But he had seen movement. He knew he had. Nathan stepped closer, his grip tightening around the hilt of his plasma blade. If there were survivors, he had to help them. If there weren't, then he needed to be sure he wasn't walking into something worse. As he neared the ship, he noticed the way the vines had already begun to creep over the shattered hull, their bioluminescence casting a soft, ethereal glow. They weren't ordinary plants. They moved, slowly, deliberately, as if sensing his presence. He hesitated before brushing them aside, feeling their slick, cool texture shift beneath his fingers, retracting like living tendrils as he stepped over the twisted metal. And then he saw her. She lay partially pinned beneath a jagged sheet of debris, her body limp, her breathing shallow. Her skin, a deep emerald hue interwoven with glowing golden markings, shimmered faintly even in the low light. The intricate patterns on her arms and shoulders pulsed rhythmically, as if responding to the planet's energy. Nathan crouched beside her, scanning for any signs of immediate danger. Her body was delicate, almost too slender to have survived a crash of this magnitude, yet there was no mistaking the warrior's resilience in her form. Even unconscious, she radiated strength. Her silver eyes fluttered slightly, unfocused and distant. She was still alive, but barely. Nathan hesitated for the briefest moment. He had encountered many species in his years of exploration, but none quite like this. She was different. And not just because of the way she looked. There was something else. A presence. A pull. He exhaled, shaking the thought away. This wasn't the time for hesitation. Carefully, he reached for the twisted metal trapping her leg. It had been warped from the impact, sharp edges gleaming under the faint glow of the surrounding flora. He wedged his fingers beneath the cold surface, bracing himself before lifting with all his strength. The metal groaned in protest, resisting for a moment before finally shifting just enough for him to pull her free. She gasped softly, a pained sound barely above a whisper. Nathan's gaze flickered to her face, noting the way her lips parted as she struggled to breathe. "Hey," he murmured, his voice low but steady. "Can you hear me?" Her head tilted slightly, her silver eyes locking onto his. And in that instant, everything changed. The second their skin made contact, a jolt shot through him. Not pain, not heat, but something cold and electric, something ancient and unexplainable. His vision blurred for a fraction of a second, his heartbeat stuttering as a strange pressure built in his chest. He sucked in a sharp breath, but the sensation was gone as quickly as it had come. What the hell was that? The woman's gaze remained locked onto his, her expression unreadable. Then, just as suddenly, she exhaled a soft whisper. Words in a language he didn't recognize, but that somehow felt familiar. Nathan leaned in slightly, trying to make sense of the syllables, but before he could process them, her body went slack in his arms. She had lost consciousness. His jaw tightened as he studied her face, a strange unease settling deep in his gut. He should leave. He had no idea who she was, what she was, or why her presence sent a ripple of unease through him. She could be dangerous. This whole thing could be a mistake. And yet... Nathan exhaled, adjusting his grip beneath her knees as he lifted her into his arms. He wasn't going to leave her here. The jungle's quiet was beginning to change, the unnatural silence shifting into something else entirely. Faint rustling, distant clicks, the telltale signs of movement. They weren't alone anymore. Something had noticed the crash. Something was coming. Nathan's muscles tensed as he turned, stepping carefully over the twisted wreckage before making his way back into the jungle. The glowing foliage swayed as he passed, casting flickering patterns across the forest floor. His mind raced with unanswered questions. Who was she? What was she running from? And why, for the first time in his life, did he feel like he wasn't just saving her? He was meant to find her? The whispers in the wind followed him as he disappeared into the shadows, the presence of unseen eyes watching his every move. And somewhere in the depths of the jungle, far beyond what his scanners could detect, something else stirred. The jungle was alive with an eerie glow, a paradox of darkness and light. Towering trees shimmered like suspended constellations, their bioluminescent leaves casting a soft, ghostly luminescence against the swirling mist. Rivers hung weightless in the air, slow-moving ribbons of silver reflecting the fractured moonlight above. It was a world that felt untouched by time, where the laws of nature twisted into something both mesmerizing and alien. Nathan moved swiftly through the unnatural beauty, his breath controlled but heavy. Zyra's unconscious body pressed against his back, her warmth a stark contrast to the cold dread settling in his chest. His muscles ached under her weight, but he ignored the strain. There was no time for fatigue, no room for weakness. The air had changed. The silence was no longer just silence. It was watching. A thick fog slithered through the trees, wrapping around his legs like phantom fingers. It crept unnaturally fast, swallowing the glowing landscape in an ominous haze. Nathan could hear the pulse of his own heartbeat in his ears, feel the fine hairs on the back of his neck rise. Then, the growl. Low. Guttural. Too close. He didn't stop. Couldn't. He adjusted his grip on Zyra and pushed forward, his boots crunching against the moss-covered ground. The glow beneath his feet flickered erratically, like a heartbeat out of rhythm. He knew better than to look back. A second growl joined the first, then a third. A chill ran down his spine. They weren't alone, and whatever was behind them wasn't in a hurry. It was waiting. He risked a glance over his shoulder and froze mid-step. Pairs of glowing eyes, pale, unnatural, hungry, pierced through the mist. First 2, then 6, then too many to count. The creatures moved as one, a shifting mass of living shadow. Their bodies were indistinct, made of something that was neither flesh nor smoke. They slithered forward in eerie synchronization, long limbs melting in and out of the darkness. The only thing solid about them were their eyes, fixated, predatory, unblinking. Nathan's jaw clenched. They weren't attacking. Not yet. They were playing with their food. He forced his legs to move, quickening his pace. The mist thickened, curling through the jungle like a slow-moving tide. It wasn't natural, it was part of them, a hunting ground of their own making. Zyra stirred against his back, a weak sound escaping her lips. It was the first sign of consciousness since he had pulled her from the wreckage. Not now, he muttered under his breath, tightening his hold. The creatures closed in. The whisper of shifting shadows sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. They weren't running anymore, they were circling, cutting him off. Nathan skidded to a stop, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His mind raced. He couldn't outrun them, not with Zyra slowing him down. He needed another option. Fast. A growl rumbled from the darkness, this time sharper, closer. Nathan spun, his instincts overriding his exhaustion. A shape lunged at him. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. He twisted his torso, dropping low to let the creature's mass sail past him. It landed just inches away, its form momentarily solidifying, long limbs, razor-sharp claws, a skeletal body wreathed in shifting shadow. And then it melted back into the mist. Nathan gritted his teeth. They weren't just hunting him. They were testing him. Another creature emerged from the fog, this one cautious, calculating. It took a step forward, then another, its movements unnervingly smooth. Nathan's fingers hovered over the handle of his plasma blade, waiting. Zyra's voice, soft but urgent, broke through the tension. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and for the first time, he saw her glowing golden markings pulse erratically, like a dying heartbeat. She whispered something, a single word. It wasn't English. Nathan had no idea what it meant, but he felt it. A shift, a ripple in the air. The jungle responded. The trees swayed despite the windless night. The glowing vines trembled, their light intensifying. The mist recoiled slightly, flickering like static. The creatures hesitated. Nathan looked at Zyra. Even in her weakened state, her body radiated something primal, ancient. Her tattoos pulsed brighter, golden light carving through the darkness like cracks in reality itself. The creatures took a step back. For a moment, Nathan thought it was over. Then the largest one screamed. The sound was wrong, like 1,000 voices shrieking at once, distorted and layered over one another. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, a sound that didn't belong in the universe. The others answered. The jungle erupted. Nathan barely had time to react before the shadows came crashing down around him. He pivoted, gripping Zyra tighter, and ran. The jungle was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. The trees groaned under the force of the creature's speed. Shapes blurred at the edges of his vision, impossibly fast, cutting through the mist like phantoms. The only warning he had were their glowing eyes, flashing in and out of existence. He wasn't going to make it. His fingers found the hilt of his plasma blade, the cool metal grounding him for a split second. He activated it. A sharp blue glow ignited in the dark. The creatures halted. The blade hummed, its energy vibrating through the air. The blue light cast sharp shadows against the mist, splitting the darkness apart. Nathan didn't hesitate. He spun, swinging the weapon in a wide defensive arc. The nearest creature reeled back with an inhuman shriek, its body severed in an instant. For the first time, the others stepped back. They weren't invincible. They could bleed. Nathan exhaled, his muscles tensed, his stance steady. He adjusted Zyra on his back, gripping the plasma blade with renewed determination. If they wanted to play, he was done running. They had a fight now. The jungle pulsed around him, alive with danger. And he was ready. The cave was a fragile refuge, a pocket of temporary safety carved into the alien mountainside. The entrance was barely visible from the outside, hidden beneath thick, luminescent vines that pulsed faintly like veins beneath the skin of a sleeping beast. Inside, the damp walls shimmered with traces of bioluminescent moss, casting a soft, eerie glow across the stone floor. The scent of earth and minerals filled the confined space, mingling with the coppery tang of blood. Nathan knelt beside Zyra, his breath still ragged from the chase. Sweat clung to his skin, mixing with dirt and exhaustion, but he forced himself to push past it. They had barely made it out alive. And now, with no immediate threats lurking in the darkness outside, his focus shifted to the woman in his arms. She was too still. Zyra's body was a contradiction. Slender, yet powerful. Delicate, yet unyielding. Even unconscious, she carried the aura of a warrior, but right now, she looked fragile in a way that unsettled him. The soft glow from the golden markings on her skin flickered erratically, as if her very essence was dimming. Nathan's gut tightened. He didn't know much about her kind, but he knew that no light should flicker like that unless something was very wrong. He reached into his pack, pulling out a field med kit, his hands moving automatically. It wasn't designed for alien physiology, but it was better than nothing. He didn't have time to question whether human medicine would help her. He had to try something. Carefully, he tore a strip of fabric and pressed it against the gash on her shoulder, watching as iridescent blood seeped through the material, thick and almost luminescent. The sight of it sent a chill down his spine. She was losing too much. He had to stop it. His fingers brushed against her wrist as he adjusted the bandage, and that was when everything changed. A sharp, electric pulse shot through his hand and up his arm, freezing him in place. It wasn't pain, at least, not in the way he understood pain. It was deeper, something that reached inside him, as if invisible threads were weaving through his bones, pulling, anchoring, binding. Nathan's breath caught. He couldn't move, couldn't look away. Then, she moved. Zyra's fingers curled around his wrist, her grip weak but unwavering. Her silver eyes fluttered open, hazy with exhaustion but sharp with knowing. He tried to pull back, but he couldn't. Something held him there. Zyra's voice was barely a whisper, but the weight in her words hit him like a tidal wave. "You saved me. You don't understand what that means, do you?" Nathan swallowed hard, his heartbeat thundering against his ribs. "Means I'm a sucker for saving alien women who crash land on dangerous planets?" She didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. Her gaze held him in place, steady and unyielding. The markings on her skin flared for a brief moment before dimming again. "It is not an act of kindness," she murmured. "It is a vow." A frown creased Nathan's brow. He didn't like the way she said it. Too solemn. Too final. "What the hell does that mean?" Zyra exhaled slowly, as if bracing herself for what came next. "In my culture, when one's life is saved at the brink of death, the bond formed is sacred, unbreakable." Nathan pulled back. This time he could move, and took a half step away. "Wait, are you telling me there's some kind of, what, blood debt? A life for a life thing?" She sat up with effort, pressing a palm to her side where another wound bled sluggishly. "Not a debt. A binding." Nathan felt his stomach drop. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, no, no, that's not how this works. I save people. That's just what humans do. It doesn't mean—" "It does," Zyra cut in, her voice quiet but unwavering. His chest tightened. Number I didn't sign up for some cosmic marriage contract. You didn't have to, Zyra said, her gaze piercing through him like twin moons through the night sky. The moment you saved me, the moment our lives intertwined in that instant, you became bound to me, and I to you. Nathan's pulse pounded in his skull. He felt it, the lingering pull in his bones, the cold hum beneath his skin where their hands had touched. That's ridiculous, he muttered. But even as he said it, something in him knew. This was real. You don't have to accept it, Zyra said softly. But it won't change the truth. Nathan clenched his jaw, looking away. His hands curled into fists, anger mixing with something deeper. This wasn't fair. This wasn't his choice. For years, he had fought against the idea of fate, of destiny. His life was his own. He had clawed his way through hell to make sure of it. And now, a single moment of instinct had chained him to someone he didn't even know. Zyra's expression softened, as if sensing his turmoil. I wish it were different, she admitted. I never meant for this to happen. Then undo it. She shook her head. I can't. Nathan let out a bitter laugh, raking a hand through his hair. Of course you can't, because that would be too easy. Silence filled the space between them, heavy and unspoken. The cave walls pulsed faintly with the rhythm of her glowing tattoos, as if echoing the gravity of what had just been said. So what now? He asked, voice tight. Zyra looked at him for a long moment. Now, we survive. Nathan exhaled, glancing toward the cave entrance where the jungle pulsed with unseen threats. Survive. Right. One problem at a time. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Something inside him had already changed. The Tark'xel village was unlike anything Nathan had ever seen. Towering structures floated effortlessly in the air, held aloft by forces he couldn't begin to understand. Their surfaces shimmered with molten light, pulsating red and gold as if they were forged from the very essence of fire itself. Pathways of energy connected the hovering platforms, flickering with strange symbols that changed shape as he moved past them. The entire village felt alive, breathing in sync with the ominous presence that surrounded him. Hundreds of Tark'xel gathered around the central platform where he stood, their glowing silver eyes fixed on him with cold scrutiny. They were warriors, their bodies adorned with intricate markings that pulsed like embers beneath their skin. There was no curiosity in their gaze, no amusement, only judgment. To them, he was an intruder, a trespasser who had broken a sacred law by saving Zyra. And now, he would either prove his worth, or perish. Komar stood at the far end of the arena, his presence radiating menace. He was taller than the others, broader, his armor-like skin reflecting the fiery glow of the village like tempered steel. His expression was unreadable, but the hatred in his eyes burned with an intensity that needed no words. You are unworthy, Komar's voice boomed through the arena, sharp and guttural. A human with no place among us. And yet, you stand here, bound by a fate you do not deserve. If you wish to live, you must prove yourself in the trial of fire. Nathan clenched his jaw. His hands bound behind his back with restraints that hummed with an unfamiliar energy. He had been in tight spots before, but nothing like this. Zyra stood to the side, her wounds hastily bandaged, her golden markings dimmed with exhaustion. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes carried something he wasn't sure he had ever seen in them before. Worry. 3 trials. 3 chances to prove he wasn't just another fragile human, or 3 chances to fail and be erased. The first challenge was strength. The Tark'xel warriors stepped aside, revealing a massive stone, twice his size, and pulsing with a faint inner light. It wasn't just a stone, it was alive with energy, shifting slightly as if resisting the touch of anything unworthy. You must carry the heart of the forge across the flames, Komar announced. If you falter, if you fail, it will consume you from within. Nathan's lips pressed into a thin line. No weapons, no tricks, just raw, unfiltered strength. The ground beneath the stone split open, revealing a river of fire, molten rock bubbling hungrily below. Nathan stepped forward, sweat already forming at his temple from the intense heat. He crouched, bracing himself, fingers digging into the rough surface of the stone. The second he touched it, pain shot through his arms, a searing heat from the inside out, like something was trying to rip its way through his veins. His teeth clenched, his muscles screamed, but he didn't let go. 1 step. 2. His boots scraped against the platform, the unbearable weight of the stone pressing down on his bones. His breath came in sharp gasps, the heat licking at his skin, the pulsing energy of the stone fighting against him with every movement. Halfway across, his vision blurred. His legs trembled. His body begged him to stop. Then he saw her. Zyra stood at the edge, her hands clenched into fists. She wasn't calling out to him, wasn't shouting encouragement. But her eyes, they told him everything. She was waiting for him to give up. Nathan growled, pushing through the pain. With a final earth-shaking step, he slammed the stone onto the final platform, the energy surging around him in a final burst of heat before vanishing. Silence. Then a roar erupted from the gathered warriors. He had passed. Komar's lips curled into a scowl, but he said nothing. The second trial had already begun. Courage. 2 Tark'xel approached, and without a word, pressed their hands to Nathan's temples. A shockwave of energy flooded through him, and the world fell away. Darkness. And then, screaming. Not his own. The battlefield stretched endlessly before him, bodies littering the ground, smoke curling from the ruins of ships and burning metal. The stench of blood filled his lungs, thick and suffocating. He knew this place. He had been here before. His past. A voice, ragged, desperate. "Nathan, help me." He turned sharply. Through the smoke, a figure. Someone he knew. Someone he had failed. His breath hitched. His hands trembled. It wasn't real. He knew that. But the pain, the guilt, the crushing weight of regret, those were real. They had always been real. The illusion didn't need to kill him. It only needed to break him. Nathan clenched his fists, forcing his breath to steady. "You're not real," he whispered, forcing himself to turn away. The figure screamed, the voice morphing into something warped and unnatural. But he kept walking. The battlefield shattered around him, and suddenly, he was back in the Tark'xel arena. He had passed. 1 trial remained. Honor. A Tark'xel elder stepped forward, carrying a sphere of golden light. "The choice is simple," she said, her voice carrying across the silence. "Use this to heal Zyra completely. But know this, you will not walk away unchanged. It will drain you, leaving you weak, vulnerable. You may not survive." Nathan stared at the sphere. He could feel its pulse, could feel the energy radiating from it. His body was already broken, his mind barely holding on. He could refuse. No one would blame him, no one but himself. Nathan's eyes found Zyra's once more. She didn't ask him to do it. She didn't beg. But she didn't look away. That was enough. He stepped forward, reached out and pressed his hands against the sphere. A blinding light engulfed him. Pain, heat, then nothing. Nathan collapsed to the ground, his breath shallow. Zyra knelt beside him, her golden markings no longer flickering, but shining with renewed strength. He had done it. And for the first time, Zyra looked at him not with wariness, but with respect. The warriors roared in approval. Even Komar said nothing. Nathan had proven himself. Not as a Tark'xel, not as a warrior, but as a man willing to sacrifice everything for someone he barely knew. And something told him. This was only the beginning. Nathan lay motionless on the ground, his breath shallow, his body unresponsive. The last thing he remembered was the unbearable pain as the energy from the sphere surged through him, stripping away every last ounce of his strength. He had expected darkness, cold, the slow descent into unconsciousness. But he wasn't dead. A strange warmth pulsed through his veins, spreading from his chest to his limbs. It wasn't the dull ache of exhaustion or the sharp sting of an injury. It was something else. Something alive inside him. The sensation built, intensifying until it became impossible to ignore. Then, just as suddenly, it focused. A sharp, concentrated heat searing through his forearm. Nathan sucked in a breath and forced himself to move. His fingers twitched first, then his arms, his legs. He blinked, his vision swimming back into focus, and when he lifted his gaze, he saw them. The Tark'xel warriors, the elders, Komar, all staring at him in stunned silence. He frowned, confused by their expressions. It wasn't awe. It wasn't even respect. It was fear. Zyra was the first to move, stepping toward him with wide, unreadable eyes. She dropped to one knee beside him, her gaze locked on his arm. "Nathan," she whispered. He followed her stare and froze. His forearm was glowing, not just from residual energy, not from the heat of the trial. Something had been left behind. An intricate symbol, ancient and shifting, had been etched into his skin, pulsing with golden light. The markings weren't human. They weren't Tark'xel either. They seemed to move beneath his flesh, adapting, evolving, alive. Nathan's heartbeat thundered in his chest. He rubbed at the mark, expecting it to fade like an afterimage burned into his skin from the energy surge. It didn't. Zyra inhaled sharply, her silver eyes filled with something he had never seen before. Horror. This isn't possible," she whispered, her voice trembling. Nathan looked up, his pulse still erratic. "What the hell is happening to me?" Zyra didn't answer. She couldn't. Because there was no answer. Nothing like this had ever happened before. A Tark'xel elder stepped forward, his movements slow, cautious, like approaching a dangerous beast. He exchanged a look with Zyra before speaking. "The prophecy," he murmured, his voice barely above a breath. Nathan clenched his jaw. "What prophecy?" Zyra swallowed hard, her gaze never leaving his arm. "You're not who you think you are," she said, almost to herself. Nathan felt a chill run down his spine. "What does that mean?" Before she could respond, Komar laughed. It wasn't amusement. It was the laugh of someone who had just watched fate twist into something monstrous. "You should have killed him," Komar said coldly, his voice echoing through the arena. Zyra's head snapped toward him. "No," she said sharply. "We don't know what this means yet." "We don't need to," Komar spat. "It's obvious." Nathan's fists clenched. "Someone want to fill me in?" Komar's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. He took a step closer, his towering figure casting a long shadow over Nathan. "When the time comes," Komar said, voice dark and certain, "you will decide the fate of us all." Nathan's breath caught. "You are the harbinger." The words hit him like a blow. "That's insane," Nathan said, shaking his head. "I'm just—" "You are not just anything," Zyra interrupted, her voice a mix of awe and dread. "You don't understand what that mark means." Nathan's jaw tightened. He had never believed in fate. He had spent his whole life defying the idea that anything was predetermined. But now the universe was staring him in the face, telling him he had been chosen for something beyond his comprehension. He could feel it. The power. The change. Whatever had happened to him in the trial, it had awakened something inside him. And for the first time, Nathan wasn't sure if he wanted to know what it was. The world around Nathan felt different. The ground beneath his feet, the air in his lungs, the pulse in his veins, it all felt like it no longer belonged to him. His own body was foreign, unfamiliar, like something was shifting beneath his skin, rewriting itself in ways he couldn't comprehend. He could still feel the heat from the glowing mark on his forearm, pulsing steadily like a second heartbeat. The intricate, shifting symbol carved into his flesh wasn't just decoration. It was something ancient, something alive. No matter how much he wanted to ignore it, he could feel the truth settling into his bones. He wasn't the same man who had crash-landed on this planet. Zyra stood in front of him, her silver eyes locked onto his, searching for something. Fear? Recognition? Answers? He wasn't sure. You. She hesitated, her voice quiet, uncertain in a way that felt unnatural coming from her. You can't be human. Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. Pretty sure I was last time I checked. She shook her head. That mark. It should not exist on your kind. Nathan stared at the glowing etchings on his arm. He had no explanation, no reasonable argument that could disprove what had just happened. He had survived something no human should have. He had absorbed something that should have killed him. And somehow, he felt stronger. His muscles weren't just sore, they were thrumming with energy. His senses were sharper, his awareness stretching beyond what he had ever experienced before. He could hear the Tark'xel murmuring among themselves, the hushed conversations happening on the other side of the floating platform. He could feel the weight of Zyra's gaze before she even moved. Something inside him had changed, and that terrified him. Zyra's voice was barely a whisper. Who are you, really? Nathan opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. He didn't know anymore. The memories of his life, his past, still felt real. The years spent as an explorer, drifting from one uncharted world to the next, chasing something he could never quite define. The solitude, the endless search for meaning in the vast emptiness of space. But now, the weight of something greater pressed against his mind, like there was something he had forgotten, or something that had been hidden from him. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable, teetering between the man he had been and something else entirely. Behind them, the Tark'xel warriors stood in rigid silence, their glowing markings flickering in unreadable patterns. They didn't know whether to fear him or worship him. And Komar, who had spent every moment treating him like an unwanted outsider, was watching him with something else in his eyes now. Caution. Calculation. Nathan clenched his fists, grounding himself. He didn't ask for this. He didn't want to be some prophecy, some figure out of legend meant to change the course of history. But it didn't matter what he wanted. The universe had already decided. A low hum crackled through the air, breaking the tense silence. Nathan turned his head sharply, his instincts already on high alert. It was the wreckage. Or rather, what was left of it. The Tark'xel had stripped the crash site for parts, but there was one thing they had left untouched. The escape pod. Nathan's stomach twisted. He had almost forgotten about it, buried under everything that had happened. The trials, the fight, the revelation of whatever the hell was happening to his body. Zyra followed his gaze, her brow furrowing. The pod! Nathan took a step toward it, then another. There was something wrong about it. It should have been nothing more than a damaged piece of his ship, another remnant of his failed landing. But as he got closer, he felt it. The same energy that had burned its way into his arm. The same pulse. He stopped just short of touching it. His breath caught in his chest. It wasn't just an escape pod. It was sending a signal. A distress beacon? A tracker? A message meant for someone. Or something. His mind raced. He had assumed that the pod had simply ejected when his ship had lost control. But what if it hadn't? What if it had been sent? By whom? For him? The realization sent a cold rush through his veins. He turned to Zyra. We can't stay here. She frowned. What are you saying? Nathan exhaled slowly, trying to suppress the growing unease curling in his gut. Someone's coming. Zyra's expression darkened. You don't know that. Nathan shook his head. I do. He could feel it. The same way he had felt the energy from the trials. The same way he could sense the Tark'xel watching him, even when their footsteps were silent. Something out there was already moving toward them. And whatever it wasn't friendly. Zyra glanced toward the Tark'xel elders, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then we need to leave. Now. Nathan nodded, stepping away from the pod. They had no way of knowing how much time they had. Hours? Minutes? Either way, staying wasn't an option. They had to run. Again. But this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about finding the truth. Nathan looked at his glowing arm one last time before rolling his sleeve down, concealing the mark. He wasn't ready for answers, but he was going to find them, one way or another. He turned to Zyra, his voice steady. "Let's go." And with that, they vanished into the unknown. Because their journey wasn't ending. It was only just beginning. Ending scene. The journey has only just begun. Nothing will ever be the same. Nathan Cross is no longer just a man. The ancient mark glowing on his skin holds the key to a secret that could reshape the universe. Is he a savior? Or something far more dangerous? And who, or what, is already on their way to claim him? This is just the beginning of a love story that defies time, space, and destiny. Want to know what happens next? Then hit subscribe, join the adventure, and be part of the ever-growing Alien Love Chronicles family. Tell us your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in Nathan's place? Subscribe now. Let's reach 1,000 subscribers together and unlock the next chapter of this cosmic love story.